Hey everyone, today we're going to do a first look review of the OneXPlayer X1 Mini as well as the X1. OneXPlayer previously released the X1 with two variations of the Intel Ultra-Core APUs, the 125H as well as the 155H. Now with the release of the X1 Mini, OneXPlayer has updated the APU to AMD with the Ryzen 7 8840U, which brings performance improvements versus the Intel variants. We'll take a look at the specs, we'll go over the device features, compare it with some other devices, test out the gameplay, as well as share some thoughts on what I think about the device. And now that we know where we're going, let's dive into it. We'll start off with the specs, and what the two models have in common is an AMD Ryzen 7 8840U. We have 32 or 64 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM at 7500 megatransfers per second. We have a 65 watt-hour battery. We have face and fingerprint unlock, detachable controllers, Hall effect joysticks, and 6-axis gyro that's in the tablet itself. We also have two USB-C ports that are USB 4. We have one USB-A port that's USB 3.2 Gen 2. Both devices have Oculink and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Now, specific to the X1 Mini, we have an 8.8 2560 by 1600 display. Behind the kickstand, we have an easy swap 2230 or 2240 size SSD. It comes with 2230. And one thing to note that the Mini does not support pen input. Then specs specific to the X1, there's a 10.95 inch display that's 2560 by 1600. We have a 2280 size SSD. As well, this device supports pen input. Now we'll take a look at the size and weight of the X1 Mini versus some other devices similar. So it comes in at 852 grams with the controllers attached. And also with the controllers attached, the X1 comes in at 925 grams. And the OneXPlayer 2 with the 8.4 inch screen comes in at 908 grams. And our last device is the Legion Go, which comes in at 865 grams. So the X1 Mini is currently the lightest option if you're looking at this style of device. Now looking at the device's overhead, you can see that the original X1 is quite a bit larger, it's wider, and the screen is significantly taller as well. It's kind of hard to believe that there's only a 70 gram difference between these two. Next up is the OneXPlayer 2. You can see that the X1 Mini is slightly wider with the controllers, but the controllers are also not as tall, so they do seem smaller. With the OneXPlayer 2, I always found that the handles were pretty good, like they're nice and beefy so you could grab onto it well, but I do find that the X1 Mini does feel better because you can wrap your thumbs around and it feels a little bit more natural to hold. And now here's the Legion Go. They're also very similar. I see that the OneXPlayer Mini is just a little bit wider because the handles come out. The Legion Go has really big grips and it's extremely comfortable to hold for the size of it. I do think it's a little bit more comfortable than the X1 Mini. The X1 Mini's controllers feel a little bit more natural, but they're not quite as thick, so you don't have as much to grab onto. And one last comparison is actually the tablets themselves. So here's the X1 versus the X1 Mini. You can see that the screen is significantly larger on the X1. You have quite a bit wider and quite a bit taller. Now taking a look at the thickness, you can see that the Mini's form factor does definitely come at a cost. It is thicker than the X1 by a significant amount. Now taking a look at the OneXPlayer 2, you can see that it has bigger bezels on the side and also a bit of a smaller screen. If you flip it up and take a look at the thickness, you can see that the X1 Mini is a little bit thinner. Although it's about maybe 1mm wider, they're fairly similar in size though. And now we have the Legion Go. You can see that the screen is identical in size. The thickness is pretty similar. It's a little bit thicker on the Legion Go in the middle, but on the sides, of course, it does taper off. And the width of the devices is pretty much exactly the same. And one bonus comparison is that the connectors on the side are pretty much the same size as the Legion Go as well as the X1 Mini. While the specs and the screen are very important factors to consider when purchasing a handheld, another factor to consider that's just as important in my opinion is the ergonomics in the controller, so let's talk about that. We'll start off first with the X1 Mini. So as we saw before, the device is not light, it comes in at 850 grams, so it is a larger handheld. So being comfortable to grip is even more important in my opinion. When you look at the controllers attached to the console, you can see that they don't stick out a lot, let's say compared to the Legion Go or the Steam Deck. And unlike the OneXPlayer 2 or Legion Go, these ones have handles at the bottom, which I think honestly is kind of nice. Although I think they could be a little bit thicker. But with detachable controllers, we're not bound to just holding the console. We can take them off and attach them with a connector. Let's take a closer look. Once you take off the controllers and attach them to the connector, you get this actually very comfortable controller to use. So how this works is it's not Bluetooth. You actually have to use this USB dongle, which is magnetically held in place, but it's also covered by this little plastic cover here. Taking a look at the controller itself, we have some back buttons here as well as the buttons to detach. The controllers are very comfortable, especially when they're on this connector. The controller layout is the Xbox style and the joysticks seem like they're in a good place. Taking a closer look at the grips, you can see that there's a little bit of a curve to it. They're not super large, but they are comfortable. They feel natural as a controller, but when you attach it to the console, they feel maybe a little bit lacking. Mostly in the way that they're not super thick, but as a controller, they're very comfortable. I found that the joysticks were a little bit loose, so I'm probably going to upgrade those with the tighter modules. To use the controllers with the connector, you just simply have to click them in place just like you would on the console, and once you've done that, take your USB-A dongle, plug it into the console, and then you could just turn on the controller to use it. Now we'll take a look at the controller itself. So we'll start off with the D-pad. The D-pad is extremely clicky, but I found that it was pretty good for fighting games. I'm definitely no fighting game expert, or I don't really play them that much, but I found with the special moves for Ryu, it was no issue to do the Shoryuken, Hadoken, and we'll call it the Tornado Kick to save myself the embarrassment of trying to pronounce the actual move. Next, when I was playing Celeste, I found that it worked fairly well, but there was this one spot that I kept getting these weird diagonals. So I was pressing up here, but I found that it tends to need a bit of an exaggerated up press. If you kind of roll into it, I was finding that it was often going left, so I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that was one thing that I did notice. When it comes to the bumpers, joysticks, and triggers, I found the joysticks feel very smooth, but they're a little bit loose. The bumpers are really nice across the board, and the triggers feel really good. They do have a pretty large motion. I did also test this on Gamepad Tester, and it seems to be a completely smooth motion, so I have no complaints about the triggers or the bumpers. Overall though, the X1 Mini is extremely comfortable in handheld mode. I sometimes feel like the Legion Go is a little bit more comfortable on some days, and other days I feel like the Mini is more comfortable, so they're very similar. I can confidently say though that I would be able to play this for extended gaming sessions without getting too much discomfort. So that's the X1 Mini, but what about the larger X1? Well, that's a bit of a different story. Let's take a look at that one. For the larger X1, looking at it strictly from handheld mode, it's definitely different than the X1 Mini. As you can see side by side here, it's just gigantic compared. It's still doable to play it in handheld mode, but I don't think I could do this for long term. If I'm resting it on my knees or possibly on a countertop, then I could probably play for long sessions. But this is definitely not a device that you're going to want to hold straight forward like in front of you, or hold it above your head if you're lying down. And although the device weighs about 70 grams more than the Mini, it's not a lot, but really it comes down to the weight distribution. With the X1, I find that it's kind of top heavy and bottom heavy at the same time. Like it kind of teeters here if I hold the controllers. And really, I don't actually think it's top heavy or bottom heavy. It's just because the controller connector is right in the center and it's such a large handheld that it's gonna feel that way regardless. When we switch over to the Mini, however, it feels a lot different. It feels more it feels heavier, strangely enough, but it's more solid, like a very solid device. And that's because the weight is distributed fairly evenly here because it's a bit smaller, so I don't really feel the teetering. It feels like it's very solid and heavy in the center, but at the same time, I don't really get tired holding it. One last thing for the X1 when it comes to handheld mode, and this is probably the biggest thing to note, is that one of the USB-C ports is blocked by the controller when you have it plugged in. On the other side, the micro SD card reader is blocked, so make sure that you have your card inserted before you put the controllers on. Unfortunately, you can't do anything about the USB-C port on the left. So when it comes to the handheld mode, I would say that the Mini is definitely superior, but there's a few areas that the X1, in my opinion, is definitely superior to the Mini, so let's take a look at those. I didn't get a chance to do too much testing when it comes to tablet mode, but I did find that the X1, the larger one, is definitely superior. First of all, because of the size. Secondly, it has stylus support where the X1 Mini does not. And honestly, thirdly is just the kickstands. The kickstand on the X1 Mini is quite small, where it runs across the entire device for the X1. The third mode is laptop mode, and I don't have the keyboard for the X1 Mini, but I do have it for the X1, and I'm going to show you why I think it would be superior on the X1 versus the Mini. With the X1, we get this magnetic cover that's quite firm, and it also has a pretty large kickstand. Now we can take the keyboard and just attach it by clicking it on. It's got a pretty strong magnet, I was able to lift up the console with it. although I definitely don't recommend doing that. So taking a look here, you can see that the keyboard is pretty much just the right size for your hands. The only thing is sometimes you bump the trackpad with your thumb, and when you're done using it, you can close the keyboard over top of the screen, put the kickstand back, and you have this tiny compact notebook you can stick in your bag. And then taking a look at the Mini, this is why I believe it's not quite as good for this mode, is that the kickstand is pretty small, and I actually found that sometimes it would slide down. Now I have a prototype, so it could just be a little bit looser on the prototype. And although I don't have a keyboard to actually show you guys, like I could just put my hands together, and it's quite cramped if you were to imagine the size of the keyboard. Although I'm sure it'll work as a laptop, I don't think it'll work quite as well as the original X1 with the 10.95 screen. One thing that's worth mentioning about the X1 Mini over the X1 though is that it has one feature that the X1 does not have, and that's easy access to the SSD. To get to the SSD on the Mini, all we have to do is remove 4 screws behind the kickstand and then you're right there. Just lift up the sticker and then you have easy access to remove the SSD. Now we'll take a look at the game performance. All of these tests have been run at a 30-watt TDP, and I had the device plugged in during the testing. Check out the timestamps if you'd like to skip to a specific game. And be sure to check out the bonus tests to see the FSR3 mod in motion.
Such acrobatic perfection. I think you're ready for our highly realistic battlefield simulator. That's right, the real deal. Impeccable. You're certainly thinking that's nice.
Not gonna let you sleep over it.
Huh? You want to
Think we could get a lot more people than
You
usual?
never know. The Sector 8 plane might have to take refuge.
If the planet's a living being, we should learn.
Another one down. Lead hostile.
And as you can see for the performance, I did all the tests at 1600p or 1440p if I couldn't do 1600p. The reason for this is that my device as a prototype only had the one resolution set up. I did set up 1080p for some other testing, but wanted to showcase the device as it arrived. So I only did 1600p. I would recommend adjusting down to 800p for a lot of games if you're looking to get that 60 FPS target, which most of the time people are going to want to do that. In a future video, I hope to do some testing of the 8840 versus the 7840, which should be similar results because they have the same iGPU. but we're gonna have to save that one for another day. Before I move on to my final thoughts, I wanted to share a couple of accessories that are definitely worth checking out if you have an X1 or an X1 Mini. The first one is the OneX eGPU from OneXPlayer, so let's take a look at it. You can connect to the OneX eGPU with either USB 4 or you can use the Oculink port. Just note that it's at the bottom of the X1 Mini, so you're going to need some kind of stand for the device. With an AMD 7600M XT, the OneX eGPU definitely boosts your gaming performance. It's something I've used a lot with my handhelds. I've used it with the AOK Zoe, OneXPlayer, Legion Go, and a number of other handhelds. And actually I'm using it right now to edit this video. You have Ethernet, 2 DP ports, 2 HDMI, as well as Oculink and USB 4. On the front we have 2 USB-A ports, and on the bottom we have a replaceable SSD. The OneX eGPU can be bundled with the X1 or the X1 Mini, and you can find this on Indiegogo. If you're looking to connect to a TV, this is an amazing option. Another accessory that pairs perfectly with this device is a pair of AR glasses. I personally recommend the Viture One Pro. This pairs up really well with the controller adapter. And now we're coming close to the end of the video. I wanted to give you a summary of what I like about the device and what could use some improvements. So let's go over that now. We'll start off first with the X1 Mini. So what I like is the controllers. For the most part, the joysticks feel pretty good. They are a little bit loose though. The controller grips are fairly comfortable. I wish they had just a little bit more beef to them though. I'm really glad to see the X1 with AMD with the 8840U versus the Intel, because the Intel is a little bit underperformant. The device is fairly comfortable to hold given its size. The screen is really nice, it's very bright, has a decent resolution, and the colors seem to pop pretty well. I also like the speakers, they're fairly decent, as well as the easy swap SSD. Now on to what can be improved. The first thing is the Oculink port at the bottom. I really don't like this. I use my eGPU quite frequently, so having to put it on a stand, it's just inconvenient. Next is the kickstand. It's fairly small. I'm not the biggest fan of it. Especially comparing it to the larger X1, this kickstand is definitely lacking in comparison. While the controller grips are comfortable, I do wish they were a little bit larger. As well, the controllers don't work without the connector if you're going to use it off of the console. And now on to the larger X1. So most of the likes and dislikes are fairly similar, but with a couple of changes. So I really like the tablet and laptop mode. I think that's probably this device's biggest strength. I like that the Oculink is fairly accessible, being right at the top. The rear cover and kickstand that's attached to that is very nice, as well as the keyboard connector. It's a really nice keyboard. Now on to the things that could be improved or that I'm not the biggest fan of. The first one is that it's a little bit awkward to hold in handheld mode. In fairness, it's a very large handheld, so I'm not sure what they could have done to make it feel a little bit less awkward. Probably the thing that I dislike the most is that the USB-C port on the left side is blocked by the controller, as well as the SD card on the right side. This seems like a bit of an oversight in the design process, or maybe they just weren't able to make it work, but it's definitely annoying to deal with. The speakers compared to the Mini are definitely quieter. They're only 1 watt versus 2 watt. And as mentioned before, the connector is required to use the controllers off of the console. And that brings us to the end of the video. This was a pretty fun device to play around with. I just got a little bit of time with it before I had to pass it forward. But a special thank you to OneXPlayer for loaning me this device to test out for you guys. If you're looking to purchase one of these devices, you can get it on the OneXPlayer store or on Indiegogo. I'll leave links in the description below. I am going to be picking up the AMD version of the X1 or the X1 Mini. I just haven't decided exactly which one I'm going to get, but I'll keep you guys posted. And once it arrives, I can get to some more testing. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.